Grant. Garcia's boots clicked in perfect rhythm across the marble, each strike crisp as a rifle report in cold air, each pivot exact enough to make the morning itself seem disciplined. 21 steps. Pause, turn, repeat. Behind him, rows of white headstones climbed the green slopes of Arlington, like silent sentinels at eternal attention. And in front of him, the plaza held a stillness so complete that even children lowered their voices without being asked. The October light came thin and pale over the ridge at first, then widened, touching stone, brass, and cloth in deliberate sequence, as if the sun itself understood protocol. Mist lifted from the grass in slow ribbons. Dew clung to the edges of pathways and flashed like small metals when the angle caught. A breeze moved through the trees beyond Memorial Amphitheater, not enough to disturb the geometry of the scene, only enough to carry the scent of wet earth and polished leather. Grant's uniform stood in that light like an oath made visible, every crease sharp enough to cut glass, white gloves pristine, kepi set to regulation angle, buttons gleaming, rifle steady against his shoulder with the calm certainty of architecture. He was 29, 6'2", broad across the chest and back, built like a wall that had learned to walk upright, but nothing in his bearing asked for attention. The discipline of the old guard demanded that the man disappear so the duty could stand alone. His face gave nothing away, carved into composure by long training and older memories. Only those who had worn a uniform long enough to read posture as language could see the deeper truth. The absolute control was not emptiness, it was force-contained, vigilance narrowed to a razor line, awareness moving over distance, angle, sound, and movement even while his eyes remained locked on a point only he could see. Families clustered along the approved viewing area in respectful arcs, shoulder to shoulder with strangers united by silence. An elderly Marine in a campaign cap stood with his teenage grandson. The boy's hair still damp from an early shower, both hands clasped in front of him after one quiet correction from his grandfather. A Gold Star mother held folded tissues in one hand and an old service photo in the other, thumb resting over the corner where a young face smiled out from another decade. A pair of high school students who had entered with the bright restlessness of field trip energy now stood motionless, phones lowered to their chests as if they had discovered all at once that recording was not the same as witnessing. Near the chain-marked ceremonial transit lane, a small girl in a wheelchair leaned slightly forward, intent, her mother crouched beside her, with one hand on the push handle, and the other wrapped around a tiny shoulder in a gesture that was equal parts comfort and pride. The child wore a navy cardigan with a unit patch sewn near the sleeve cuff, its thread worn soft at the edges from being touched often. She looked at Grant with the unblinking concentration children reserve for things they instantly recognize as real. Not costume, not show, real. He reached the end of the mat, paused, turned, and came back through his line with the same measured cadence, the rifle never wavering. 21 steps. Pause, turn, repeat. The sequence had been practiced until muscle, breath, and intention became one mechanism, yet it never became routine. Routine dulled, ritual sharpened. The distinction mattered on this ground where memory was not decoration, but duty, and where each motion answered a question the dead could no longer ask. Are we forgotten? The sentinel's walk was the nation's reply. A tourist in a windbreaker whispered, barely audible, "How long can he do that?" "Longer than most of us can stand still," murmured a man beside her, a veteran by the look of his posture, and the faded regimental pin fixed to his lapel. Neither voice carried far. The plaza absorbed sound and returned only what belonged there: the click of soles, the shift of fabric, distant birds, the low rustle of people breathing in unison while they watched a standard of conduct older than any one life in the crowd. Grant's focus never broke, but the world entered him in disciplined layers. He registered a stroller wheel at the back row rolling too close to the curb, then corrected its trajectory in his mental map when the father adjusted. He tracked the sun sliding another inch over the marble and calculated the coming glare that might make first-time visitors step forward without noticing the chain line. He marked the Arlington security supervisor at the far edge of the plaza, hands clasped, scanning with professional calm. He noted the ceremonial lane to his right, clear and ready. Brass links hung between black posts like a boundary between reverence and carelessness. Not a barrier for power, a safeguard for process, for movement, for funerals that would pass with families who had already paid too much. He had once read roads in Kandahar by blast patterns and tire marks pressed into dust before dawn. He had learned to map panic by shoulder tension and eye movement in crowded streets where 1 second separated normal from catastrophe. Those reflexes had not left him when he traded combat boots for mirror-polished ceremonial shoes and the kinetic noise of deployment for the deliberate silence of Arlington. They had been refined, redirected, given a new mission. Here, vigilance did not hunt enemies. It protected dignity. The crowd could not see that internal geometry. They saw stillness. They saw polish. They saw a ceremonial soldier marching with machine precision beneath a clean sky. What they did not see was the depth under that surface, the private architecture of grief and duty that held him upright when memory pressed hard. Under his jaw, hidden by collar and shadow, a pale shrapnel scar traced a narrow line that tingled in cold weather. It was a small mark by battlefield standards, the kind medics documented quickly before moving to worse injuries, but he felt it each morning as a tactile reminder that he stood among the living by margin, not entitlement. He passed the center point again. The rifle shifted in perfect synchronization with the turn. White glove, dark wood, bright brass, stone and cloth in ordered contrast. A boy around 10 tugged his father's sleeve and asked in a whisper, "Does he ever get tired?" The father kept his eyes forward. "He does. He just carries it." That answer hung in the air with unusual weight. Carrying was the verb that governed this place. Families carried folded flags home. Veterans carried names no one else remembered to speak. Children carried questions that would grow larger with age. Sentinels carried tradition, minute by minute, step by step, with no applause required. Arlington did not promise relief from that burden. It promised that burden would mean something. The morning advanced by degrees. By 9:15, sunlight had fully overtaken the mist and laid a clear, bright sheen across the marble facade, while shadows from the amphitheater columns stretched long and disciplined over the plaza like bars on a staff. More visitors gathered at the perimeter, and yet the sound level somehow dropped further, because each newcomer felt the atmosphere before reading any sign. A man in business clothes removed his sunglasses and held them in his hand rather than wear them. 2 middle school girls who had arrived chatting fell silent halfway through a sentence and stayed that way. An older couple with matching veteran pins stood with fingers interlaced, saying nothing at all. Grant continued his cadence through all of it, unhurried and exact, as if each pass along the mat stitched the crowd into a shared standard for a few sacred minutes. The precision was not performance and never had been. Performance sought reaction. This discipline sought alignment, a reordering of priorities in public view. On these stones, ego had no rank. Spectacle had no authority. The only accepted currency was respect, paid in attention. At the edge of the transit lane, the little girl in the wheelchair lifted her chin, eyes following him on each turn with fierce concentration. Her mother noticed and leaned down. "You okay, sweetheart?" The child nodded once. "He doesn't look away." "No," her mother whispered. "He doesn't." Grant heard the exchange as part of the ambient field and kept moving, though the words landed in him with quiet force. Not looking away was the heart of it. Not from memory, not from sacrifice, not from the truth that freedom was expensive and the bill had been paid by names carved into stone, by names still unknown, by names carried only in the minds of those left behind. The Sentinel's presence was an answer to forgetting, a refusal enacted in leather, wool, metal, and time. He turned again. The kepi brim cut a clean line across his brow. The Tomb Guard badge flashed once, briefly, then settled back into matte restraint. Around him, cameras remained lowered, mouths closed, shoulders squared. The crowd did not need instruction now. They had entered the same tempo. A retired Army nurse near the back row, Desert Storm pinned bright against her coat, watched with wet eyes and a steady jaw. She spoke softly to the tourist beside her, not taking her gaze off Grant. "People think this is about ceremony. It is. But it is also about debt." The tourist swallowed and nodded. "I can feel that." "You're supposed to." A gull cried from somewhere over the trees, then silence reclaimed the space, fuller than before. Grant completed another pass, then another, each identical and each distinct, because the meaning was carried fresh every time. 21 steps, pause, turn, repeat. In a culture built on acceleration, he moved at the speed of remembrance. In a world crowded with broadcast noise, he spoke through discipline alone. In a nation that risked forgetting what sacrifice looked like when stripped of slogans, he embodied a plain, difficult truth. Honor was not a feeling. It was a practice. The brass chains along the ceremonial lane caught the sun and held it. Bright arcs suspended between black posts, unglamorous and absolute. Beyond them, Arlington stretched in ordered rows beneath a widening sky. Around them, Americans from different ages and histories stood in the same hush. And at the center of it all, Grant Garcia's boots struck marble in sacred cadence, steady as a heartbeat, while the morning gathered itself around the sound and listened. Then the chain snapped upward with a bright metallic rattle that did not belong in that silence, and a woman in a designer ash-gray jacket vaulted the brass links, as if she were hopping a curb outside a nightclub instead of crossing a ceremonial boundary on sacred ground. Her mirrored sunglasses flashed sun straight into the crowd. Her selfie stick rose above her head like a flag of surrender to vanity. She grinned into her own lens and said, loud enough for her feed and everyone else, "There it is, guys. Crossing the line they don't want you to see." The plaza froze. An elderly Marine's jaw locked so hard the muscle jumped near his ear. The teenage grandson beside him took one involuntary step forward and stopped as his grandfather's hand closed around his forearm. The Gold Star mother's tissues slipped from her fingers and landed by her shoe, untouched. Two high school boys, who had been quiet for 20 minutes, lifted their phones by reflex, then lowered them again with visible shame. The little girl in the wheelchair tightened her grip on her mother's sleeve and did not blink. Brielle Voss turned in a slow circle for the camera, framing the marble, the lane, the crowd, and Grant in one sweeping shot built for outrage clips. Her smirk was practiced, precise, calibrated for metrics. She was young, polished, and utterly certain that consequences were content with a better thumbnail. "Look at this," she said, tilting the phone toward the chain posts. "They put up jewelry rope and call it untouchable. Chains are just optics." A whisper moved through the visitors like wind through dry leaves. "Ma'am, no," somebody said from the back. "Get her out of there." Another voice muttered, angrier, tighter. Grant Garcia did not break posture. To the untrained eye, he remained exactly what Brielle had decided he was, an immaculate soldier in perfect ceremony, a figure polished into stillness, a human monument incapable of interruption. But what she could not see, what her chat could never read through a front-facing camera and a smirking filter, was that she had just stepped into the perimeter of a man who had spent years learning the geometry of danger under fire. He had tracked crowded market movement in Kandahar where one wrong angle became shrapnel. He had read shifts in breathing and shoulder tension in Syria alleys where panic arrived a fraction of a second before violence. Beneath the kepi and white gloves stood not a prop, not a performer, but a sentinel with combat-forged threat calculus, running in clean, silent layers. Brielle walked backward along the restricted lane to widen her shot, narrating her own trespass in a bright, taunting voice. Tell me this isn't theatrical. Dude's literally a parade prop. She thumbed at Grant without looking directly at him, then laughed into the microphone clipped near her collar. Hey, statue soldier, you gonna blink for my followers? The words hit the crowd like an insult in church. The retired army nurse with the Desert Storm pin stepped forward half a pace, then held herself in place with visible effort. That lane is for funeral movement, she said, steady but sharp. You need to step back now. Brielle angled the phone toward her, delighted by resistance. See? Free cameo from Protocol Police. A few in the Livestream chat flashed across her screen in a rapid vertical blur of hearts, laughing emojis, and escalating dares. One read jump the other side, another read touch the post. She fed on it, chin high, pivoting for reactions. She had built her career on boundary stunts, monetized indignation, and the profitable fiction that disrespect was courage if edited with energetic music. Her sunglasses hid her eyes, but the tilt of her head telegraphed the same message as every one of her clips. Nothing here is real unless it can be turned into engagement. Grant completed his turn at the mat's edge, rifle aligned, jaw set, expression unreadable. Inside, the map updated. Chain breach confirmed. Crowd density tightening near lane perimeter. Child in wheelchair 2 steps from the right post. Mother crouched, attention divided between daughter and intruder. Security supervisor at far side, line of approach partially blocked by tourists. Time to incoming ceremonial movement, narrowing by the minute. The morning had been built on cadence. Brielle replaced it with static. A held breath seemed to pass through the plaza as the scene remained locked in place, and in that suspended second the tension clarified into its true shape. This was never a clash between a loud influencer and a quiet soldier. It was a collision between 2 moral economies. One traded in attention at any price. The other was built on duty paid in silence, precision, and memory. Brielle kept moving backward to keep herself centered in frame. Her shoes clicked off marble in erratic syncopation against Grant's measured cadence, jarring enough that several visitors flinched each time her heel struck. You all are so dramatic, she told her viewers, voice bright with contempt. I crossed a decorative chain. Nobody died. The words echoed off stone and landed hard because everyone present understood what she did not. Those chains were not decoration. They marked transit for families walking behind caskets, for horses pulling caissons, for details carrying names into ground that would hold them forever. The boundary existed, so grief could move without obstruction. It existed, so process stayed clean when emotion could not. It existed because order was mercy when people were burying their dead. A father near the 3rd row pulled his 2 sons closer and spoke low, eyes fixed on Brielle. Hats off. Both boys removed their caps in the same motion. Nearby, an older couple followed. Then a college student in a hoodie folded his arms, lowered his gaze, and stopped recording. The crowd was not theatrical now. It was wounded and trying to stay respectful inside anger. Grant passed center point again. 21 steps, pause, turn, repeat. The ritual did not falter. That, too, was message. He would not grant spectacle the authority to rewrite sacred tempo. Yet the internal calculus sharpened with each second. Brielle's path drifted 3 feet right. The wheelchair sat just beyond the post line. The child's front caster wheel had turned slightly outward, making a quick reposition harder if movement surged. The mother's knuckles had gone white on the push handle. The girl looked up at her mother. "Why is she in there?" Her mother swallowed. "She shouldn't be." Brielle heard the child and pivoted instantly toward vulnerability, because vulnerability generated comments. She lowered the phone for a closer angle and crouched halfway, still inside the lane. "Hey, sweetheart, tell them I'm not hurting anybody." The mother shifted the chair back an inch, shielding her daughter with her shoulder. "Do not film my child." "Oh, relax," Brielle said, already turning away. "Public place." The Marine's grandson made a sound that was nearly a protest, but his grandfather squeezed his arm again, hard enough to communicate both restraint and fury. "Stand fast," the old man whispered, more to himself than to the boy. "Let the right people handle it." From the far drive came a faint, rhythmic clatter of harness fittings and measured hoofbeats, still distant but unmistakable to anyone who had spent time near ceremonial operations. Not loud yet, not immediate, but coming. A few heads turned toward the sound and then back to the lane, anxiety tightening shoulders across the crowd in visible sequence. 3 days earlier, Arlington operations staff had updated timing windows for morning movement details to account for traffic along the service approach. Grant remembered the memo, the adjusted minute marks, the caution language about clear lanes and crowd control. The detail expected on this route would not stop for social media theater. It could not. Ceremonial continuity mattered because families relied on it. Grief had enough chaos already. Brielle kept talking to her stream, pacing backward in small, careless steps, while checking herself on screen. "Watch this engagement spike," she said with a laugh. "They're mad because I touched their little no-go zone." A veteran in a wheelchair near the rear perimeter spoke up, voice rough with age and smoke. "That zone carried my son's casket." Silence dropped hard after that line. Even Brielle paused for half a heartbeat, not from respect, but from calculation, deciding whether the clip could be cut for drama. She settled on a shrug and aimed her phone toward him. "Sir, I support troops all the time. This is about transparency." The retired Army nurse's expression hardened into something almost clinical. "No," she said, projecting just enough to carry. "This is about ego." Grant's eyes stayed fixed forward, but his awareness swept left to right in disciplined arcs. Security supervisor now moving, 3 visitors inadvertently blocking direct path, likely 30 seconds to clear. "Secondary security radio hand at shoulder mic, speaking fast. Crowd compression rising along outer chain. Child still nearest vulnerable point. Mother protective but pinned by people behind her. Influencer vector unstable." By the second week of October, the morning chill at Arlington could cut through wool and leather before the sun cleared the ridge. But now heat moved through the crowd from a different source. Outrage held under discipline. People shifted weight, clenched jaws, tightened hands, and still no one crossed into the lane to grab Brielle, because sacred spaces demanded control even when provoked. That collective restraint was its own kind of honor. It left the burden exactly where it belonged. Brielle lifted her selfie stick higher and gave the camera a conspiratorial smile. If this gets clipped, stitch it. Caption it. I crossed their fear line. She took another backward step without looking. Her heel struck the slight rise where marble met lane edging, and she rocked, windmilling one arm for balance. She recovered, but the stumble carried her closer to the wheelchair by a dangerous half-step. The little girl recoiled. Her mother pulled the chair back sharply, one wheel catching at the chain post base, with a metallic tap that rang too loud in the tightened air. Grant registered all of it. Angle, distance, obstruction, timing. The hoofbeats from the drive sounded clearer now, still controlled, still measured, but no longer distant enough to ignore. The crowd understood the same thing at once. Murmurs rippled like wildfire, then collapsed into a tight hush edged with fear. Brielle, hearing only her own feed, backed up again. Her smile returned for the camera. She had no idea she was seconds from forcing a decision that would test the oldest rule she was mocking. That discipline held until duty demanded motion. Grant did not move. He stood at the edge of motion and held the line inside himself. The way men hold a door in heavy wind, every hinge straining, but still fixed. From the crowd, he was ceremony in wool and brass, a sentinel cut from discipline, eyes forward, jaw steady, rifle anchored. Inside, his awareness tracked in hard geometry. Heel placement, lane width, chain post spacing, child's wheel angle, mother's stance, hoof cadence closing from the drive. He mapped it all in one sweep and then another, not frantic, not hesitant, just exact. By 9:17 that morning, the sun had climbed high enough to turn every polished surface into signal. The marble reflected bright white into faces. Brass links burned gold between black posts. The amphitheater columns threw long bars of shadow across the lane, and those shadow lines crossed the ground like quiet boundaries inside boundaries. The scent of damp grass still rose from the slope beyond the plaza, but now it mixed with leather, horse tack, and the faint bite of shoe polish warmed by light. A flag above the trees moved once, then settled. No one spoke above a whisper. The crowd looked like a cross-section of the country standing under oath. The elderly Marine in the campaign cover had gone rigid through the shoulders, one hand still locked on his grandson's arm, the tendons standing out at his wrist. The boy beside him had the raw, stunned expression of someone learning that disrespect can feel like a physical blow even when no one is touched. The Gold Star mother had bent to pick up her tissues, but stopped halfway, fingers trembling over the stone as if she had forgotten what she was reaching for. Two high school girls who had arrived with chatter and glitter pens now stood straight-backed, mouths set, phones dark at their sides. The retired Army nurse with the Desert Storm pin kept her chin level and her breathing measured, eyes flicking from Brielle to the approach road and back again, the practiced scan of someone who had triaged chaos before. Near the right post, the little girl in the wheelchair sat very still now, one hand twisted into her cardigan sleeve, the stitched unit patch pressed under her thumb. Her mother had shifted her own body between her daughter and the lane without realizing she had done it. Knees bent, shoulders angled. Protective instinct overriding etiquette, in plain view. Behind them, a father had both palms on his son's shoulders, holding them in place with gentle pressure. An older couple with veteran pins stood hand in hand and did not blink. Even tourists who knew little about military protocol had read the room. They could feel, without being told, that they were standing at the edge of something sacred and strained. At the center of that strain, Grant's uniform held its immaculate authority. The kepi sat at regulation angle, brim casting a precise shadow across his brow. The dark coat fit like armor tailored by ritual, every seam straight, every line intentional. Buttons gleamed in disciplined sequence down his chest. His white gloves were spotless, fingers curved around wood and steel with practiced economy. The Tomb Guard badge caught sunlight once and then went matte again, like a star going behind cloud. His shoes, polished to mirror finish, reflected broken fragments of sky and crowd as he shifted weight through tiny, controlled adjustments, invisible to anyone but another professional soldier. The M14 remained steady against his shoulder, neither threat nor ornament, only duty carried with absolute control. He could hear Brielle still narrating into her phone, voice pitched for reaction, but her words no longer mattered to his calculations. Sound broke into layers, hoofbeats approaching in measured rhythm, light metal clink from harness hardware, a security radio crackling from the far side, a child's quick inhale, somebody whispering a prayer that never rose above breath. He had learned long ago that panic made noise, training made order. He chose order. Kandahar had taught him what happened when one person broke movement discipline in a corridor that others depended on. The pale scar beneath his jaw had come from shrapnel and a secondary blast, and it never let him forget how fast a preventable hazard became permanent. The memory surfaced as instruction, not nostalgia. Protect the vulnerable, preserve the lane, intervene only when necessity crossed the line. He reached the end of his measured segment, paused, turned with ceremonial precision, and resumed the 21. To the crowd, it was the same immaculate cadence they had watched all morning. Internally, each step was a live update. Brielle had drifted another half-step backward along the inside edge of the chain line, shoulders squared toward her front-facing camera, chin lifted in performance. Her right heel landed close to the painted seam, where marble met the slightly lower drive path. Her left hand cut the air in exaggerated gestures as she talked to her viewers, framing the audience behind her as props in her own feed. "Still here," she said into the phone, smiling without warmth. "Nobody can do anything. This place is all optics." The retired Army nurse's jaw tightened. She did not advance, did not reach out, did not break the physical boundaries she had already respected. She projected her voice with parade ground clarity, controlled but sharp. "That lane is for funeral transit. Families are incoming. You're not brave, you're in the way." Brielle gave a small laugh and angled the camera toward the nurse for a beat. "See? Ego police." "You're proving the point," the nurse shot back. "Move out now." The little girl in the wheelchair flinched as Brielle's backward path edged closer. Her mother immediately tightened one hand on the push grip and nudged the chair 6 inches back, wheels clicking softly over stone joints. With her free arm, she kept herself between Brielle and her daughter, posture low and protective, eyes fixed and unblinking. "Do not film my child," she said, voice firm, carrying farther than she intended. "Turn that camera away from her." Brielle turned just enough for the lens to catch them anyway. "Public place," she said. "Relax. Do not film my child," the mother repeated. Louder now, the words hitting the marble like strikes. Grant's gaze did not break, but he adjusted his internal map. Mother and chair had moved back. Brielle had moved with them without understanding she had done it, still retreating as she talked, still stealing space from people with nowhere clean to go. The child's left footplate now sat near a dark expansion line in the stone. Another forced move could bind the wheel angle. The chain post to their right limited lateral retreat. Behind them stood 2 rows of observers, shoulders packed, frozen by the same code that had kept everyone from rushing in and making it worse. The father near the rear sensed the compression and lowered his voice to his sons, urgent and reverent at once. "Hats off!" Both boys obeyed immediately, caps to chests, eyes wide and silent. The gesture, small and old-fashioned, rippled through the people nearest them. A few who were still covered removed their hats without being told. Respect returned to visible form even as disorder tried to claim the lane. The elderly Marine's fingers dug deeper into his grandson's sleeve when the younger man shifted forward. "No," he muttered, not taking his eyes off Brielle. "You old." "She's right on that kid," the grandson hissed, anger cracking at the edges. "I know exactly where she is," the Marine said. "You hold." A gust moved through the amphitheater opening and lifted the brass chain links in a brief metallic whisper. Brielle took another backward step to stabilize after the wind tugged at her loose jacket. Her sneakers slid on a leaf pressed flat against the marble. For one instant, her balance went off axis, hips twisting, phone arm windmilling, heels skidding along the lane edge. The little girl recoiled hard into her chair back, eyes squeezing shut. Her mother snapped the chair another fraction backward and planted both feet, braced for impact that did not come. Brielle caught herself with a sharp hop and a curse under her breath, then laughed as if the stumble had been intentional. "Still good," she told the phone, breath thinner now. "Still standing." The crowd's inhale was collective, involuntary. The sound of dozens of people witnessing a near miss and understanding that the margin had collapsed. Grant completed the turn at the end of his next segment and felt the timeline constrict. Hoofbeats were no longer distant texture. They were distinct strikes now, countable, with the harness clatter layered closer behind them. The caisson team was on schedule. The ceremonial corridor could not remain compromised when they entered the transit approach. The protocol sequence in his mind advanced to its next decision gate. Across the plaza, the Arlington security supervisor appeared between two clusters of visitors, moving hard with one hand raised shoulder high, signaling for space. "Clear lane! Clear lane!" he called, voice kept low but forceful to preserve the solemn register. His radio mic flashed near his collar as he spoke into it. A second officer came in from the perimeter entrance, angling toward Brielle's blind side. Both were still too far for immediate contact. Brielle saw motion in her screen before she saw it with her eyes. She twisted slightly, then recentered on herself, refusing to yield the frame. "Now, security once in," she said with a grin that looked increasingly brittle. "Because truth scares institutions." Nobody answered her. The silence around her had changed shape. It was no longer shocked silence, no longer even anger. It was the hard, compressed quiet of witnesses who knew they were seconds from an outcome. The retired Army nurse took one controlled step to improve her line of sight, then stopped again, hands visible and open at her sides. "Last warning," she said. "Move out of that lane." Brielle ignored her and backed up another pace, this one shorter and less certain than the last. The little girl's breathing had gone shallow. She kept her hand pressed over the worn unit patch like it was an anchor point. Her mother leaned close without taking her eyes off Brielle. "I've got you," she whispered. "You're okay. Stay with me." Then louder to Brielle. "You are endangering my daughter. Move." The Gold Star mother had finally straightened, tissues still in one hand, but she remained rooted where she stood, face wet, attention locked forward. The veteran with the regimental pin stood beside the tourist in the windbreaker, both rigid, both silent, both tracking security's approach with the same fixed concentration as everyone else. No one broke rank. No one surged. The entire crowd held discipline by force of will alone. Grant's next 21 steps carried him parallel to Brielle's position. He measured distances with peripheral precision, from Brielle's heels to the wheelchair footrests, from wheelchair handles to chain post, from chain post to his own intercept line, if protocol breach became mandatory. His breathing stayed even. His shoulders stayed level. The rifle remained perfectly controlled against his shoulder seam. At step 16, he caught the click of a security earpiece not 50 feet away. At step 19, the horse detail's iron cadence reached the acoustic threshold where any further lane obstruction became unacceptable under duty. At step 21, he halted into the formal pause. The pause lasted the required beat and contained an entire decision matrix. From the far side, the Arlington security supervisor had finally cleared the crowd knot and was moving fast, one hand up, voice cutting low through his radio mic. A second uniformed officer appeared at the perimeter entrance and started in. The horse detail's cadence was closer now, iron on pavement in deliberate beats that carried their own authority. Brielle still held her camera high, still harvesting her own reflection, but her backward steps had shortened. Even she could feel consequence converging. The Marine spoke without taking his eyes off the lane. "He's calculating," he whispered to his grandson. The boy swallowed. "How can you tell?" "Because nothing on him's wasted." Grant drew one measured breath, held it, released it slow through his nose. His face remained a mask of discipline, unreadable as carved stone. Under that stillness, every instinct stood ready, not for dominance, not for spectacle, but for a single controlled act in service of the fallen and the living both. Brielle Voss had built a career on that exact breath before consequence, the split second when decent people still hoped she might correct herself, and she knew she would not. She had come up through prank channels and reaction reels, then sharpened her brand into something cleaner and colder. Calculated intrusion dressed as authenticity. Airports, museum ropes, closed rehearsal floors, memorial steps after posted hours, any boundary that could be framed as elitist control became her stage. She called it access journalism for regular people. Her legal team called it protected expression. Her sponsors called it high engagement social disruption. In private contracts, it was simpler than all that, reduced to weekly deliverables and conversion targets tied to outrage velocity. If a clip drew anger from veterans, officials, teachers, or grieving families, it performed better. If she received a warning, a citation, or temporary removal, it performed best of all. Accountability was not a risk in her model. It was proof of concept. Two visitors near the back recognized her in the same instant, and the recognition traveled through the line in hushed fragments. "That's Voss," one man muttered, disbelief flattening his voice. "She did that courthouse staircase stunt." A woman beside him answered without looking away from the lane. "And the hospital parking entrance. She posted herself mocking the barriers." The elderly Marine heard both and set his jaw harder, understanding now that this was not ignorance under stress. This was intent under branding. By the middle of that month, Brielle's subscriber count had climbed high enough that marketing firms referred to her as a category rather than a creator. She arrived at sites like this with advanced planning and deniability layered together. One assistant trailing at a distance, geotags delayed, plausible confusion rehearsed, and statements pre-drafted if authorities reacted. She wore mirrored glasses to hide her eyes and reflect the crowd back at itself. She wore a fitted jacket whose cut signaled money without logos, loud enough to alienate viewers. Even her sneakers were chosen for camera movement, soft-soled and silent until the stone betrayed her rhythm. In her world, location existed to serve narrative, and narrative existed to serve monetization. Grant knew none of her sponsorship numbers and did not need them. He could read her operating pattern from movement alone. She never looked at the chain before crossing. She looked at the lens. She never scanned exits for safety. She scanned faces for reaction. Her posture kept opening toward her own screen while her heels invaded everyone else's space. She had no ceremonial vocabulary, no sense of funeral timing, and no respect for lane discipline. Yet she moved with absolute confidence because she mistook stillness for permission. That was the fatal assumption at the center of her confidence. If the guard had not rushed her, shouted at her, or grabbed her, then he was decorative. To her, restraint meant weakness. To him, restraint was strength under law. She lifted the phone higher and gave her stream another bright smile that strained at the edges. "Clip this part," she said. "This is where institutions try to scare you with uniforms." Her thumb flicked through comments as she spoke, feeding from them with practiced speed. "You see the toy soldier? He can't do anything. Whole setup is theater." The words landed like a slap across the plaza. The teenage grandson's nostrils flared, and for a heartbeat he looked ready to shout. The Marine squeezed once, and the boy swallowed his voice down, eyes burning. The Gold Star mother closed her fingers around her tissues until the paper compressed into a white knot. The retired Army nurse drew one careful breath and measured her response as if she were selecting instruments under pressure. "You are standing in restricted ceremonial transit," she said, each syllable clipped clean. "Step behind the chain. Now." Brielle turned her shoulder enough to keep herself centered and answered without removing the smirk. "I'm documenting public space, ma'am. Try not to panic." Grant remained in profile to the lane, face carved into official calm, but the internal map tightened another degree. He tracked the nurse's line, the Marine's anchored stance, the two officers still threading through the crowd, and the hoarse cadence now unmistakable on the approach route. He tracked the child's front caster still angled wrong for a fast reverse. He tracked the mother's feet planted, left foot slightly behind right, a protective base but vulnerable if jostled from behind. He tracked Brielle's shoulder drift and the arc of the selfie stick, sweeping near eye level. He tracked everything and offered none of it to his expression. The crowd had become a moral instrument, every person vibrating with contained force. Veterans stood with their spines straightened by reflex. Parents pulled children one half-step back from the lane edge. High schoolers who had arrived as spectators now watched with the solemn concentration of witnesses. A man in a business coat removed his lapel pin and tucked it deeper, as if even that tiny flash of metal felt too loud for the moment. An elderly couple near the second row leaned toward each other but said nothing. Their joined hands spoke enough. Across the front, people who had never met shared one instinct. Hold position, do not escalate. Trust the protocol that had held this place long before any of them arrived. Grant completed another measured segment. The pause at the turn was flawless, but inside it his body shifted from ceremonial pattern toward intervention readiness. Shoulders loose, elbows quiet, center of gravity lowered without visible drop. The rifle remained controlled and non-threatening, exactly where it belonged. His white-gloved left hand relaxed from formal tension to functional precision. Breathing stayed even. 4 count in, 4 hold, 4 out. Heart rate rose and stabilized. Peripheral vision widened. If action became necessary, it would be minimal, directional, and complete. A whisper carried from the rear as a man in a veteran cap spoke to no one in particular. "He sees all of it." Another answered, barely audible. "She sees herself." Brielle kept narrating as if the whispering were applause. "People in chat are saying this is staged," she laughed. "I wish. This is real control culture." She pivoted, backpedaled 2 short steps, and pointed her lens past Grant toward the open plaza. "Look at him. Parade boy won't even look at me." Grant heard the label and filed it with the rest. Irrelevant. Names could not alter geometry. Distances did. His combat memory did not arrive as cinematic flash. It arrived as instruction encoded in muscle and judgment. Outside Bagram, he had learned that crowds in shock moved in pulses, not lines. In Syria, he had learned that one unstable actor could redirect an entire flow by half a meter and cause a cascade 3 bodies away. On patrol, he had learned to read the pre-incident signatures others missed. Bright, performative voice, narrowing foot placement, delayed response to warnings, attention fixed on a device instead of terrain. The same signatures were present now, translated from war zone to sacred public ground. Different stakes, same imperative. Protect the vulnerable first, preserve the corridor second. Apply force only in proportion to necessity. The mother near the chain bent toward her daughter again. "Eyes on me," she whispered, voice trembling but controlled. The little girl nodded and then looked back at Grant anyway, as if his stillness were the only fixed point left. She pressed her thumb harder against the worn unit patch on her sleeve. Her father's unit patch. Grant had seen that detail earlier and logged it. Now it carried weight like an order quietly repeated. At 9:18, the iron rhythm of the approaching horse team reached the plaza with full clarity, each strike a metronome of duty closing distance by the second. Security was almost in range. The Arlington supervisor pushed through a final knot of visitors with an open palm and low command voice. "Make space. Keep the lane clear." The second officer angled wide to avoid crossing in front of the crowd's sightline, moving with deliberate respect for ceremony even under urgency. Their professionalism steadied the perimeter, but did not solve the immediate hazard inside the chain. Brielle remained between them and clean control, still drifting backward, still talking to her viewers, still one misstep from contact with the child. The retired nurse recognized the same timing window and shifted her weight forward, then stopped herself short. She knew enough not to create competing vectors in a constrained lane. Her eyes cut to Grant for one instant, and in that instant she understood what most of the crowd still did not. He had already selected his intervention threshold and was waiting for the lawful, necessary moment with exact discipline. She lowered her chin and held. Brielle glanced at the incoming officers, then at her own reflection, recalculating whether confrontation might yield a better clip than compliance. Her voice rose brighter to mask the uncertainty. "Guys, security inbound. If they touch me, you saw everything live." She gave a small laugh that did not reach her mouth. "Screenshot this." No one answered her. Even her own audio sounded thin against the stone. Grant reached step 9, then 10, then 11, boots striking in sacred cadence that now felt like a countdown written in leather and discipline. He passed parallel to the wheelchair again and measured the gap, too narrow for an officer's fast entry without risking collision, barely enough for a controlled intercept from his current line. Brielle's heel drifted over the seam again. Her left shoulder rotated back toward the child as she framed herself against the chain for dramatic contrast. The selfie stick dipped, then rose. The mother tightened her hold on the push handles and braced. Step 12. Step 13. Inside Grant, every muscle was coiled but not tense, primed in the paradox only hard training could produce, ready to move at full commitment, while appearing untouched by urgency. His jaw stayed neutral. His eyes remained fixed forward, yet peripheral data streamed and sorted with machine-like clarity. He had one lawful breach available before ceremonial integrity suffered, and he would spend it only once. No warning barked for cameras, no dramatic posture. One controlled motion, one command, one protected lane. Step 14. Step 15. The Marine's grandson whispered, "Why doesn't he just grab her?" The older man answered through clenched restraint, "Because he serves something bigger than his anger." The boy nodded, absorbing that sentence as if it were a lesson he would carry for years. Step 16. The horse cadence grew louder. Step 17. The first officer reached the outer chain line but could not enter cleanly. Step 18. Brielle took another backward half-step without looking. Her heel clipped the slight lip at the lane edge, and her body rocked toward the wheelchair. The mother pulled back hard, but the right wheel caught for a fraction against stone and chain base. The little girl gasped. The crowd made one sharp, collective sound and froze again. Grant's threshold was crossed. He reached step 19 with perfect form and already knew that step 21 would not end in a ceremonial turn. It would end in protocol breach, executed not for spectacle, not for punishment, but because this path belonged to the fallen and the living under his protection. Step 20 landed like a metronome, strike on marble, sharp and final, and Grant Garcia broke protocol with the precision of a surgeon choosing a single incision. He did not lunge. He did not shout. He took 3 measured strides off the ceremonial line, each one controlled, each one placed to create a barrier without creating panic, and his white-gloved left arm extended across the lane at chest height between Brielle Voss and the wheelchair in one clean, unarguable line. "Ma'am, behind the chain, this path belongs to the fallen." The sentence cut through the plaza like steel drawn across stone. Brielle froze in mid-step. Her heel hovered above the seam where she had stumbled twice. Her selfie stick tilted, then stopped, and the phone still pointed at her face, but the smirk she had curated for years collapsed in real time under the weight of a voice that carried no anger and no uncertainty. Her livestream audio caught the shift instantly. One collective gasp, the metallic jingle of her bracelet hitting the stick handle, then an older veteran's whisper from somewhere left of frame, low and fierce. "About time." Grant's face never changed. His eyes remained hard and unreadable beneath the brim of the kepi, locked not on the camera, not on the comments flooding her screen, but on the hazard geometry in front of him. He rotated his torso half a degree to widen the protective angle around the mother and child, keeping his rifle stable and safe, body turned into living architecture. To most of the crowd, it looked effortless. Inside, every muscle was calibrated, shoulder set, core anchored, peripheral scan running in layered arcs. Brielle tried to recover the frame with a brittle laugh. "Okay, wow, parade boy talks." Grant did not answer her performance. He kept his arm extended and gave one command, quieter this time, somehow heavier. "Step back." The mother in the wheelchair lane did not wait for a third exchange. She caught Grant's angle, understood it instantly, and used the opening he had created. Grant shifted one half-step right and placed his gloved hand on the push handle with explicit, controlled intent, eyes briefly dropping to the wheel lock and caster angle, then back up to the lane. "Ma'am, with me," he said to the mother, formal cadence intact. "We're moving 2 feet left." She nodded once. "Thank you." He guided the chair clear of the chain base in one smooth motion, turning the front caster out of bind and aligning the chair parallel to the spectator line. No jolt, no scrape, no drama. The child's breathing steadied as soon as the wheels settled on open stone. She looked up at him with wide, stunned eyes, still clutching the worn unit patch on her sleeve. Grant released the handle immediately and returned his hand to neutral position, preserving distance and dignity. By then, the horse team cadence had reached the near drive, iron rhythm and harness clink, rolling toward the corridor with solemn authority. Less than 30 seconds had passed since Grant left his line. The Arlington security supervisor entered the lane from the outer edge at a controlled run, one officer at his shoulder. "Phone down, ma'am," the supervisor ordered, voice clipped and professional. "You are in restricted ceremonial transit. Move behind the chain now." Brielle swung the camera toward him, searching for a new villain angle. My audience is watching this live. Don't touch me. No one is touching you, the supervisor replied. Comply with instructions. She hesitated, eyes flicking to Grant, then to the approaching detail, then back to her own screen, where comments now moved too fast to read. The crowd held silent pressure from every direction. The Marine's grandson had gone still as carved wood. The Gold Star mother stood with tears on her face and tissues crushed in her hand. The retired Army nurse watched with clinical calm, chin lifted, ready to testify if needed. Last command, the supervisor said. Behind the chain. Brielle took 2 backward steps and crossed out of the lane, this time without a flourish. The second officer guided her to the spectator side with an open hand indicating direction. No force, no spectacle. The moment she cleared, the supervisor pivoted to secure a straight corridor. Lane clear, he called into his radio. Grant stepped back to his ceremonial mark with the same 3 measured strides he had used to leave it, resumed exact posture, and reclaimed stillness so completely it was as if motion had never touched him. Yet everyone present knew they had witnessed the one act that mattered most in that entire morning. Discipline yielding to necessity for exactly as long as duty required, then returning to form. The caisson team entered the approach in perfect order, horses steady, tack polished, handlers composed. Conversation died entirely. Even Brielle's feed went strangely quiet, her own voice reduced to a thin murmur, while the procession passed through the lane she had called decorative. No one in the crowd looked at her now. Every gaze followed the movement detail, and the moral hierarchy of the scene settled into place without argument. 1 minute later, a dark staff vehicle stopped at the perimeter access point, and a full-bird colonel stepped out in service uniform, silver eagle bright against his chest. He moved with the speed of an officer who had been briefed en route and who intended to leave no ambiguity when he arrived. At his side came Arlington's operations chief for ceremonies, tablet in hand, expression hard as granite. The security supervisor met them at the chain line and gave a concise report. Sir, civilian subject crossed restricted transit chain during active ceremonial window, he said. Ignored multiple verbal warnings from visitors and staff. Continued backward movement toward vulnerable spectator in wheelchair. Staff Sergeant Garcia executed minimal protocol breach to block hazard and clear spectator. Subject removed from lane without force. Live stream and body cam footage preserved. The colonel's eyes moved once to Grant, taking in the restored posture, then to Brielle, who was now standing with her phone lowered to waist height, sunglasses finally off, confidence draining in visible increments. Name, he said. She lifted her chin as if she could still steer tone. Brielle Voss, content journalist. You are not credentialed press on this ground, the operations chief said flatly, checking the tablet. You are logged as general visitor. Brielle opened her mouth to counter, but the colonel raised one hand and ended the attempt before it formed. You breached a restricted ceremonial lane, he said. You interfered with active operations tied to military funeral movement. You ignored lawful instructions. You created a public safety hazard near a child. Arlington is not your set. The crowd heard every word. A murmur moved through the spectators, not triumphant, more like release after a held breath. The Marine closed his eyes for 1 second and exhaled through his nose. His grandson stared at Grant with a new expression that looked like respect settling into permanent shape. The retired Army nurse folded her hands and gave the smallest nod. Brielle tried one last pivot toward her stream. My followers saw everything. I was exercising free speech. The colonel's reply came in parade ground clarity. You were trespassing in a controlled lane during ceremonial transit. Free speech is protected. Interference is not. He turned to the supervisor. Issue citation for restricted area trespass and interference with ceremonial operations. Process 1-year exclusion from all Arlington ceremonial zones, effective immediately. Document her recording device as evidentiary media. The supervisor acknowledged. Yes, sir. The second officer stepped in with a printed notice and read the terms. Brielle's hand shook once as she signed acknowledgement on the tablet. Her live stream, still running, captured her silence far better than any argument she had made all morning. The operations chief directed a technician to clone the public stream archive link and attach it to the incident file, resolving the evidence chain on site. A QR-coded case receipt was handed to Brielle and one to the supervisor for records. No loose ends, no missing artifact. Everything logged. The colonel took one step toward Grant's position and spoke without disrupting ceremonial dignity. Staff Sergeant Garcia. Grant answered from stillness. Sir, your judgment was correct. Your restraint honored the mission. Yes, sir. Nothing more was needed. The validation landed with the force of a gavel. The colonel then turned to the mother and child near the front line, his tone softening without losing formality. Ma'am, are you and your daughter all right? The mother steadied herself and nodded. Yes, Colonel. Thanks to him? The little girl looked from the colonel to Grant, then back, and gave a small, solemn nod of her own, hand still resting on her father's patch. Brielle, now flanked by the officer and supervisor, finally understood that the frame had shifted beyond her control. She looked down at her own live preview, at the comments that had turned from cheering dares to blunt condemnation, and ended the stream with a thumb press that seemed to cost her more than stepping behind the chain ever had. As she was escorted toward the perimeter exit, she passed the retired Army nurse, who did not gloat, did not taunt, only spoke in a level voice meant for anyone close enough to hear. You just watched a tomb guard choose restraint over humiliation and duty over ego. Learn from it. Brielle kept walking. The security supervisor transmitted final status into his radio. Incident contained. Lane secure. Subject removed. Citation issued. The external contact thread closed in real time, precise and documented. The colonel conferred briefly with operations, confirmed the funeral corridor remained on schedule, and departed as quickly as he had arrived. Grant resumed his measured cadence when signaled, boots striking marble with restored rhythm, as if sacred order had reached forward and reset the metronome by hand. 21 steps. Pause, turn, repeat. The crowd watched in full silence, changed by what it had seen. Not rage, not spectacle, but disciplined force applied at the exact point where remembrance and protection became the same duty. The caisson detail moved through the cleared lane in solemn precision, black horses steady beneath polished harness, handlers aligned shoulder to shoulder, the measured iron cadence of hooves taking possession of the corridor that had been defended for exactly this purpose. Grant remained on his line, expression unreadable, boots striking marble in sacred rhythm as the procession passed. 21 steps. Pause, turn, repeat. The crowd stood bareheaded now, not by command but by conviction, and the silence around the transit path held the shape of prayer. When the final wheel cleared the lane, the Arlington supervisor gave 2 short hand signals to his team. One officer reset the chain links to full tension between the posts. Another photographed the seam where Brielle had stumbled and the post base where the wheelchair had caught, then logged both images to the same case file as the live stream and body cam archives. A maintenance technician arrived with a small pouch and removed the flattened leaf from the lane lip, checked the stone edge with a gloved hand, and noted no structural defect, only surface debris amplified by backward movement. The strange detail that had nearly become disaster was reduced to fact, documented and closed. At the perimeter, the operations chief reviewed the digital evidence receipt on the supervisor's tablet, confirmed the upload hashes, and read the incident chain aloud for accuracy. Public stream archive captured at 0921. Body cam 1 and 2 synced. Citation acknowledged. Exclusion order entered. Device copy request declined by subject. The supervisor answered each line with a clipped confirmed, and the chief signed electronically, forwarding the packet to Arlington Legal and Ceremonial Command. Nothing remained loose. Grant kept walking. The retired Army nurse waited until the lane had gone still again, then turned to the cluster of tourists nearest her, including the woman in the windbreaker and the college student who had lowered his phone earlier. Her voice stayed low, but each word carried. You saw why protocol exists. It is not about control. It is about making room for grief to move with dignity. The woman in the windbreaker nodded, eyes wet. I didn't understand that until today. The nurse answered, Most people don't. Then they do. The elderly Marine finally released his grandson's sleeve. Red marks from his grip showed on the boy's forearm, and the old man noticed, rubbing the spot once with an apology in his eyes before speaking. You asked why he didn't grab her right away, he said. That answer is your lesson. Strength is not volume. Strength is timing. The grandson looked toward Grant, who turned at the mat edge with the machine precision. I thought discipline meant standing still. The Marine's mouth tightened, then softened. Discipline means choosing the right action, not the easiest one. 3 rows ahead, the Gold Star mother stepped quietly toward the mother with the wheelchair child and offered the folded tissues she had been clutching. For both of you, she said. The child's mother accepted them with a shaky exhale. Thank you. They did not exchange names. They did not need to. Shared recognition did the work of introductions on that ground. Grant reached center point and returned through his line. The Tomb Guard badge flashed once in the strengthening light, then settled again into matte restraint. To the visitors, he looked unchanged from the first minute of the morning. Inside, his pulse had already come down, not because the moment had been small, but because control had done its work. He had intervened at threshold, protected the vulnerable, preserved the lane, and restored ceremony without feeding spectacle. It was the exact equation he had trained for, and training had held. By late afternoon, the administrative aftermath moved through official channels with the same insistence on precision that governed the plaza. In the operations office, fluorescent light replaced sun glare, but the discipline was identical. The Arlington security supervisor sat across from a legal clerk and dictated the final narrative supplement, while the body cam clips played on mute. Subject repeatedly warned by civilians and staff. Hazard escalation linked to backward filming. Staff Sergeant Garcia executed minimal intercept and vulnerable party reposition. He paused only once to verify timestamps against the horse detail log. The clerk entered each correction, printed 2 copies, and stamped both. 1 went to file. 1 went to command. At 4:12 p.m., Public Affairs returned a media inquiry about the incident with a formal statement. Restricted ceremonial transit boundaries are enforceable. Interference with operations triggers removal and exclusion, and no family movement was delayed. At 4:40, a representative email from Brielle's management requesting context review received its written reply. Citation upheld, exclusion upheld, appeals process available, after 1 calendar year. External contact resolved. Across town, Brielle posted a short apology video from a neutral indoor backdrop, voice steadier than her morning stream, but stripped of performance confidence. I crossed a restricted line at Arlington and disrespected ceremonial operations. That was wrong. She disabled comments within minutes. By 6:03 p.m., 2 major sponsors issued public notices ending partnerships effective immediately, citing conduct inconsistent with brand values around military remembrance. By 7:11, a third sponsor followed. At 9:47 that night, her channel page returned an error message where a subscriber count had stood that morning. She deleted the channel before midnight, and the archive links already logged in Arlington's case file remained intact as the permanent record she could no longer edit. As the day thinned toward evening, Arlington changed character. Tourist clusters gave way to smaller knots of veterans and families speaking in low voices. The wind turned cooler. Shadows from the amphitheater columns lengthened across the stone, and the white headstones beyond took on that late light glow that made each row look both softer and more severe. A flag above the ridge moved in slow, deliberate waves, catching bronze at the edges where the sun dropped. Grant reported for sunset watch at the tomb. His uniform was reset to absolute standard. Kepi aligned, brass polished, gloves immaculate, shoes mirror bright, rifle steady. If the morning had left weight in him, he carried it where he carried every burden, inside posture, inside breath, inside the private chamber where names lived. Nate Whitaker's laugh rose there for a moment, bright and irreverent. The chow line joke that had survived blast fire and years because memory refused to surrender what mattered. If I drop this tray again, promote me to culinary artillery. Grant did not smile. He honored it by standing straighter. The evening crowd gathered in respectful arcs. The retired Army nurse returned, now with her coat buttoned against the cold, and stood near the back beside the Marine and his grandson, who had come back after lunch instead of heading home. The college student in the hoodie was there again, too, empty-handed this time, no phone visible. Near the front, the mother with the wheelchair child appeared just before the relief sequence, moving carefully along the paved edge to the approved viewing line. The little girl wore the same navy cardigan. The worn unit patch remained stitched near the cuff, thread softened by touch. She held the edge of it between finger and thumb as Grant stepped onto the black mat, the world narrowing around the first strike of his soul on marble. Click. The sound traveled clean in the evening air. 21 steps. Pause, turn, repeat. The cadence settled over the plaza like a restored heartbeat. No one whispered now. No one tested boundaries. The brass chain links beside the ceremonial lane hung still, gold in the last light. No longer a prop in anyone's frame, only what they had always been. A line that protected passage for the fallen and those who walked behind them. On Grant's third pass, the child looked up at her mother. The mother bent close. The girl whispered something, and the mother nodded once, eyes already shining. When Grant reached the turn nearest their position, the child lifted her father's unit patch with both hands, held it at chest level, and gave a small, solemn salute from her wheelchair. Elbow sharp, wrist straight, face set with the fierce seriousness only children and soldiers can share without translation. Grant did not break cadence. He did not step off line. At center turn, within regulation composure, he gave the slightest nod. Barely a movement, almost nothing, and yet everyone who saw it understood exactly what it meant. Received, honored, carried. The Marine's grandson drew in a breath that sounded like awe. The old man beside him placed one hand on the boy's shoulder, not restraining now, only affirming. The retired nurse closed her eyes for one beat and opened them again, steady. Grant continued. Boots on marble, rifle stable, white gloves pristine in the fading light. Beyond him stretched rows of white stones under a darkening sky, each marker a name remembered, or a name entrusted to memory itself. Above them the flag moved slow and sure. The chain-marked lane stood clear. The plaza held silence without strain. 21 steps, pause, turn, repeat.